11th day, upper wind month, 1 CE, 2000 hours. Eh? Another one? How hungry are these guys? Far below, a lion beastman left a long trail through a green field of spring grain. Raoul raised his goggles, looking ahead to a farming village about 500 meters away. He pointed with a leather-clad hand. Beastman headed to that village there, 500 meters northwest of it. Contacting the nearest sergeant, the elder lich riding behind him said. Raoul sighed, following the beastman's trail of trampled grain back to where a much larger set of trails was being made. He lowered his goggles over his eyes again, trying to make out what was there. It was too far to make out for sure even with his goggles, but it looked like 3 adults and 6 children. His eyes went back to the lone beastman headed towards the village. It was probably trying to get food to feed the others it left behind. Normally, one would help people out if they were hungry, especially if they had families to feed. But these people ate other people. Over 15 hours had passed since the battle in the valley and the start of their sweep across the Draconic Kingdom. The undead army had long spread out and was chasing the remaining beastmen across the province. They were under orders to drive them forward, but not kill them. While that was being done, the Draconic Kingdom's citizens were to be protected. A pair of bone vultures glided below them. They tucked their wings and dove on the lone beastman, driving it away from the oblivious village. Throughout the day, they found that most of the villagers looked like they stayed indoors whenever possible. It forced the beastmen to break into their homes, but it also meant that the people never knew when the beastmen were coming. Target has been deterred from its objective, the elder lich behind him said. He watched the beastman limp away. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel bad for them. Being hungry sucked. He knew what it was like to be hungry from the time before the Sorceress Kingdom. People got skinny and weak. It was easy to get sick and even getting hurt a little bit could be a big problem. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that people changed. If things were bad for a long time, the way people thought twisted. They stopped caring about anything other than themselves and the ones closest to them. Sometimes, not even that. Everyone became a competitor. An enemy, and everything one could do to survive, even if it hurt others, looked more and more reasonable. Raoul didn't know whether these beastmen were considered good or bad people to their own kind, but Captain Zaradnik was intent on pushing them as far as she could. She wanted to learn as much about them as quickly as possible so they could complete their objectives in the Draconic Kingdom efficiently. When she explained what she was doing during briefings, reports and their discussions over the battlefield, it sounded rational. But there was another way to look at it. The captain wasn't merely satisfied with beating the beastmen, she wanted to know how to break them. While they studied the beastmen, Captain Zaradnik had gone ahead to Blighthold, where another force was securing the city ahead of the fleeing beastmen. Raoul and Olga were left behind to help coordinate field operations and learn what they could. So far, Raoul felt that what the beastmen did was understandable. It might have been because they were desperately trying to run away and couldn't do much of anything else. Like humans and some of the other races that he knew about, these beastmen formed groups with one another. He wasn't sure what their families looked like, but they at least protected the members of their groups, especially children. Adults would split off once in a while to look for food. Sometimes they caught birds and small animals, other times they were lucky and found loose livestock or game. They would bring back their kills and share them with the others. According to what the captain had heard, beastmen were fast over short distances, but worse than a human of the same strength over long distances. She told them that this wasn't true for all beastmen, but it looked like it was with these ones. Since they were running with children and old people while also trying to gather food and stopping to rest, they were super slow. Even if he were on the ground, Raoul thought he could just outwalk them everywhere. Their undead were ordered to move as fast as it looked like the beastmen could move. He was beginning to think that this type of beastman, who called themselves Ermadash, couldn't even cover the same distance that zombies could in a day. Then again, that was probably unfair since zombies could walk all day and all night. How far are they from the town? Raoul asked. At their current rate of travel, the elder lich answered, approximately 3 hours. Are they still going straight there? Yes. About 30 kilometers down the road from the site of the night's battle was the northwesternmost town of the Draconic Kingdom. It was pretty much a straight route and the sea was on one side, so it was hard for the regular undead to get around to force the beastmen to change direction without running right over them. I guess we should push them away, Raoul said. Let's fly over. The skeletal dragon banked southwards. Ever since the frost dragons came to the sorceress kingdom, Raoul wondered if he would be able to ride a dragon one day, but his hopes had been fulfilled in an unexpected way. They weren't anywhere near as fast as frost dragons, but the captain said that they made perfect flying platforms for the Royal Army's commanders since they could loiter over a theater forever. What should we use? He frowned down at the town and its surroundings. How many elder liches do we have nearby? 8. 8 was a lot. Especially since they were allowed to use their most powerful summons. The problem was that the undead army was behind them and they couldn't do anything that might make the beastmen think that the undead were up to anything special. Raoul figured they'd notice what was going on pretty quick, but Captain Zaradnik always did tricky things that made him scratch his head over how weirdly stupid people could be. What do you think? Raoul asked. This one is uncertain what you are asking, the Elder Lich answered. How can we make them change direction without screwing up the plan? The Elder Lich fell silent for a few moments. One of the sergeants suggests that we emulate the flanking maneuver from the recent battle. The flanking maneuver, you mean how the infantry company came in? But we're not supposed to trap them like that. The sergeant was referring to the idea that undead pursuers might come from the sea. Oh. Would it work? The beastmen couldn't see what was in the water, so if the undead started attacking them from that direction they might move away from the shore. The town was on the shore so they'd end up going around it. Let's see what the shore looks like. From their height, Raoul could already see how the land was shaped, but he wasn't sure if there were cliffs or anything in the way. The skeletal dragon reached the shoreline, settling into a wide circle as he examined the terrain below. It's pretty rocky, he said, but I guess that's okay. The land sticks out a little here too so we can summon stuff without being seen. They were told to avoid bringing the undead into the water, if possible. Demi-humans and other things might be living in the sea and the sorceress kingdom didn't want to make enemies by accident. The elder liches flew down to a beach littered with jagged boulders. Raoul watched them, wondering what they would bring out. What do you recommend that we summon? The elder lich asked. Me? I think blood meat hulks would be good. The beastmen are on the run and they're too tired to fight anything strong. Blood meat hulks are big and tall so they'll be seen from far away, plus these beastmen already know what they are. Maybe they'll run the second they see them coming. Below them, the elder liches spread out, summoning 4 blood meat hulks each. With that many stomping around, they would be difficult to miss. The line of newly summoned undead headed west towards the nearest group of beastmen. Don't go too fast, Raoul said. We'll end up stepping all over them. All we need to do is lumber in their direction. The blood meat hulks slowed down, taking ponderous steps while swinging their dangling arms back and forth. He wasn't sure whether the elder liches were doing it on purpose or not, and he wasn't sure if he should ask. About 10 minutes later, they came close enough for the first groups of beastmen to react. The all swerved away. Their new path would take them far to the side of the town down the road. That worked really good? Raoul couldn't believe that things had gone so well. We've squished them into a narrower space to watch, too. There might have been over 1,000 beastmen on the run, but the corridor that they were chasing them down was 30 kilometers across. It would gradually grow wider the further they went, so the Royal Army was trying to figure out how to keep things manageable with what they had. While their forces would grow from all the beastmen that fought and got turned into zombies, it still wouldn't be enough to make a giant line across the front. Anomalous behavior has been reported on the right flank. Raoul turned his attention to the reported location. Ahead of the right side of the blood meat hulk line, several beastmen had gathered. He adjusted his goggles, trying to get a better look. 4 adults, it's those tiger warriors, though. Is this happening anywhere else? Similar behavior has not been observed elsewhere. What were they doing? He couldn't tell how strong they were. During the battle, groups of the tiger beastmen ganged up and easily destroyed blood meat hulks, but could one group win against so many? How shall we respond? The elder lich asked. We don't even know what they're up to, Raoul replied. We're not supposed to kill them, either. Oh, they're moving. The party of beastmen charged up and attacked one of the blood meat hulks. One tried to climb up the undead construct, but fell off when it took a ponderous swing at the others. The beastmen scattered and ran off towards the next. "They're trying to lead them away?" Raoul asked. "They started from the right side and they're headed across the front of the line. Follow them for now. Make sure you don't run them down." One by one, the blood meat hulks lumbered off after the beastman group. The beastmen eventually got all of them and started leading them northwest. They didn't seem to care whether they'd run into the other undead bringing up the rear. "What nonsensical behavior," the Elder Lich said. "These specimens appear to be suicidal. Have they been inflicted with some unknown status effect?" "We're controlling what they see," Raoul softly repeated what the captain told them earlier. "And they only see what they want to see. This one does not discern any logic behind your statement." Raoul looked over his shoulder. The Elder Liches, whether they were from the Royal Army or working in the administration, were weird in certain ways. They had logic which was determined by what they believed was true. Everything was broken down into processes that were grounded in those beliefs. If what they observed couldn't be subjected to their reasoning, the Elder Liches tended to dismiss it as irrational, inferior or impossible. "It means that our overall strategy is working," Raoul said. "We're trying to convince the beastmen that an undead horde appeared. It's one gigantic trick so the beastmen don't think we're trying to save the Draconic Kingdom. The beastmen down there are acting as bait so the blood meat hulks don't catch up to the others trying to run away. They don't need to, but they don't know that. They've made up their minds about what's going on based on what they can see." "Your explanation implies that they expect to perish," the Elder Lich said. "We have been discouraged from killing any beastmen during this phase of the operation, but if we do not eliminate them, they may uncover our ruse." That was true, too. They'd start wondering why they weren't dead yet at some point. Raoul examined the area around the beastmen heroically sacrificing themselves to save the others. The main body of the undead horde was still far behind the wave of fleeing beastmen. Between the two lay an expanse of farmland, copses, and villages. "Make some of the blood meat hulks get lost," Raoul said. "Lost?" "Yeah, like the ones furthest away and make them wander off like they lost track of the beastmen. Make them keep chasing imaginary beastmen until we have a few spread out." "What is the purpose of doing this?" the Elder Lich asked. "So we can control where the beastmen are going," Raoul answered. "Those guys down there still think the undead are mindless enough to be lured around, so we'll use that idea to spread the blood meat hulks out. Then the blood meat hulks will catch on again and come from a direction that makes the beastmen change direction." "What is the target direction for the beastmen?" Raoul pointed to a cluster of about 6 dozen buildings 2 kilometers north of where the beastmen were. "That village. Don't go straight towards it though, just close enough for the beastmen to see it." "Our orders are to protect the Draconic Kingdom's citizens," the Elder Lich told him. "Your suggestion appears to go against those orders." "The villagers have all locked themselves inside their houses from before," Raoul said. "The blood meat hulks will be right on the beastmen's tails, so they won't be able to stop and break down any doors." The Elder Lich raised a hand to the side of its skull. Raoul fidgeted nervously as he watched the beastmen run ahead of the blood meat hulks. Their pace had noticeably slowed, turning more into a slow jog. "Captain Zaradnik has approved of your plan," the Elder Lich said after a few minutes. "Huh? Really?" He was almost sure he'd get in trouble. Olga would have definitely started yelling at him for taking unnecessary risks. "Once the maneuver has been completed, you will report to the captain with your results." Now that he had permission, he wasn't sure if he should do it. What if something messed up? He had to go and report to the captain afterwards. "Your orders?" "Let's start spreading out the blood meat hulks." If he said something and took it back, that'd be bad too. He wasn't sure what was worse, being a wishy-washy commander or one that took risks. Far below, a few blood meat hulks slowly drifted apart from the others. After that, some of them stomped away at different angles while others pretended to look around in confusion. Even though mindless undead could only carry out simple instructions, the Elder Liches were weirdly good at acting with them. Ahead of the blood meat hulks, the line tracing through the grass by the beastman group wavered. It looked like they were trying to decide where to run with some of the undead breaking off from them. After a moment, they turned southeast. Raoul frowned at the abrupt change in direction, which nearly got them stomped on by the blood meat hulks still chasing them. His gaze went ahead, then he realized what was happening. "Make those blood meat hulks that wandered southeast notice them." The beastmen turned back. Raoul let out a sigh. What happened to them having trouble focusing on more than one thing at a time? He muttered. Our observations over the past few days indicate that their behavior varies according to situation and motive. Different races of beastmen also display different behavioral tendencies. In the case of these Na, they may also have special training as warriors. I guess that makes sense. Even though beastmen were strong, most of them weren't trained to fight. Warriors were probably trained to harness their instincts, or a few humans with spears would be able to poke one to death. The only ones that used combat-related skills, abilities or martial arts so far were the Tiger ones. The Tiger ones weren't all warriors, either. They found a few Na tribes in the Draconic Kingdom's capital filled with civilians. In all, it made it confusing to sort the beastmen out. They couldn't even treat the civilians as civilians because they were a lot more dangerous than the average human and wouldn't hesitate to attack them. Raoul could only tell if one was a warrior after it did something that made it stick out from the rest. The sound of barking rose from the village ahead. Is that a cow? No, it should be an actual dog. He wasn't sure if it was because of the dog, but the beastmen changed direction to head straight for the village. Stop barking, dog, he muttered. Run away. The dog kept barking. Raoul eventually spotted it standing in the street. It was a black and tan sheepdog, standing in front of one of the homes near the edge of the village. One of the incoming Na pounced on it and carried its kill away. Damn it. Is something the matter? The elder Lich asked. They killed that poor dog, Raoul said. All it was doing was standing in front of its home trying to scare them away. I see. How respectable. What? Dying for one's master is a respectable fate, is it not? The elder Lich said. I believe this is also codified in human literature. There were stories about knights and heroes that defended princesses and innocents from danger, but, was that how it was? Rather than feeling respect for the dog, he was angry that the beastmen killed it. Don't follow the beastmen out of the village, Raoul said. Spread the blood meat hulks around the buildings. That's quite clever of you. Good job, Raoul. Raoul started at the voice to his right. Captain Zaradnik was there flying alongside the skeletal dragon. See, Captain. Raoul awkwardly imitated the salute of the undead servitors. You saw all that? You're calling me that now too, huh? The captain smirked. I don't know who started it, but everyone in the army's been using it since this morning. And yes, I was watching what you were doing. You've learned a lot since we started. He turned his head away in embarrassment, unsure how to respond. This one does not understand what was achieved, the elder Lich said. It has to do with a problem that the general staff has been trying to address, Captain Zaradnik said. We're purposely driving these beastmen ahead of us as part of our overall strategy, but it's becoming clear that the Irma can't outpace the undead. We needed to do something the beastmen could rationalize as behavior that allows them to stay ahead. At the same time, it gives us a way to better direct their movements and keep the Draconic Kingdom's citizens out of harm's way. Did that mean the captain understood what he was trying to do the moment his idea was reported to her? Raoul wondered how she could put things together that fast and act so decisively. People always called him aggressive, but he was constantly second-guessing himself. We're headed to Blighthold, Captain Zaradnik told them. You and Olga have been awake for nearly a full day, so you're long due for some rest. But I don't feel tired. You need to be awake when you need to be awake, the captain replied, so you need to sleep when you need to sleep. Now that we have a good idea of what the beastmen can handle, we'll be setting a reasonable pace for them. It should be about another 2 weeks before we push them across the Forced River, so I hope you don't expect to stay awake that entire time. A 1-hour flight southeast saw them circling over Blighthold, a small port city sitting on the west bank of the Selan estuary. Its plazas and streets were filled with far more people than it should have had, making it look as crowded as the Draconic Kingdom's capital. His skeletal dragon glided over its grey stone walls, sending the city's sentries scurrying for cover. Citizens in the streets similarly panicked, ducking under eaves and into dark alleys. The skeletal dragon's flight brought it over the harbour, where Raoul saw the familiar sight of Ruin's Wake moored at the longest pier. After landing beside the ghost ship behind a second skeletal dragon, probably Olga's, Raoul hopped off and boarded Ruin's Wake. Raoul, over here. He turned at the sound of Olga's voice. His classmate's head stuck out from a doorway near the hole in the hull. It looked like she had arrived long before him. She was all cleaned up and dressed in the simple blouse and kirtle that he usually saw her wearing in Warden's Vale. No one would have expected she had just come from a battle with thousands of beastmen. Raoul entered a cabin where a table had been set up and a map laid upon it. Captain Zaradnik was standing on one side of the table with her adjutant, Psycho, arranging markers on the map. "There's a trooper's towel on the shelf there," the captain pointed to the wall closest to him. "A fresh change of clothes and some blankets as well. Pick out an empty cabin to sleep in tonight and get changed and cleaned up. We'll begin our debriefing once you're ready." He went and did as she asked, returning to find dinner waiting on the corner of the table. Olga was already halfway through her sandwich. The elder liches controlling the skeletal dragons had joined them, as well. "First," Captain Zaradnik said, "I'd like to say how pleased I am with our progress over the past few days. The rushed nature of this operation made me wonder if everything would fly out of control at some point, but, so far, things have been shaping up as well as can be expected. Please make sure the others know as well." Raoul washed down a bite with a cup of warm tea on the table. Commander Lynam and, Commander Lynam talked about all the things that might go wrong, but could any of it really happen? We've had a few battles so far and it was like we were toying around with them. Chasing them all day today showed us how weak they are when things get stretched out. Some of our initial fears proved not to be as severe as we initially thought them to be, the captain said, but the fundamental issues remain. Our objective in this campaign is not only to fight the beastmen, but to preserve the lives of as many of the Draconic Kingdom's surviving subjects as possible. Captain Zaradnik looked around the table as if waiting for anyone else to say something. When no one did, she looked down at the map between them. "Earlier today," she said, "Raoul pointed out something that we can use to maintain our image of an undead horde while also allowing us to control beastman movements. Honestly, it's something that we should have considered long before, but our desire to not damage public sentiment by putting the undead too close to the citizens early on forestalled our use of this tactic." "What tactic is it, lad?" Captain Zaradnik, Olga asked. "Eating the citizens," the captain replied. Olga stared at the captain. Raoul's lip twitched. "Not literally," Captain Zaradnik smirked. "We hit the limit of how far the beastmen seemed to be able to run for a day about an hour ago. They started dragging themselves into copses and brushland after that, looking for places to hide and rest. The central element of the Katsa force is roughly 15 kilometers away from where the beastmen started to exhaust themselves. If the undead continue advancing at their current pace, they'll overrun the beastmen in their sleep." "The Draconic Kingdom is really flat," Olga said. "The horizon is only 5 or 6 kilometers away. There aren't any hills or anything to look further from. Well, maybe they can climb some trees, but we can still stop the undead far away enough that they can't be spotted. Why move the undead into villages if we can just stay out of sight? Because we've already set a pace for the undead. I at least assume the beastmen know that the undead don't need rest, so we need to show them why they're slowing down. We don't need to move into every village that they've already passed, just enough to convince them of what's going on. There is also another aspect of this we can exploit." The captain's hand moved ahead of the beastmen's lines, indicating the area between them and the Selan River. "We can have some groups of undead get ahead of the resting beastmen and consume settlements. This will deter any attempts to hunt the residents, as they'll assume that they're all dead. The beastmen should only get as close to the villages and towns as they can detect the undead, since getting any closer risks the undead being drawn to the beastmen instead." "What if the Draconic Kingdom's citizens attack our forces?" Psycho asked. "That would be annoying," Captain Zaradnik answered, "but we should be able to make them retreat. Since we're moving in advance of the beastmen, our sergeants can use mind-affecting spells to stuff villagers and their pets into their homes. Hopefully, they'll stay indoors and not cause any trouble in the first place. The beastmen will feed on what little livestock remains to survive, but I think that the Draconic Kingdom's citizens would consider that an acceptable alternative." "Will we be doing this for the entire campaign?" Raoul asked. "If it proves to be useful, yes. In addition to being able to preempt the movements of the beastmen, it may also convince them that they can reliably depend on humans as distractions for the undead. That way, they'd refrain from attacking human settlements or taking humans with them. It would be nice if they could keep people from dying like that." Raoul's gaze went to the fortress marked on the nearby northern border. "What about Haifort, Mom?" Aren't we supposed to free the people in there? We are, Captain Zaradnik nodded. The beastmen will make it to the Selan River in about 2 days, so we'll secure the fortress and its surroundings before then. Any questions or concerns before I have these updates relayed to the General Staff? Raoul shook his head. So did Olga. The elder lichers remained silent. All right, the captain said. Oh, one more thing, Raoul, you became angry when the beastmen killed that dog. Yeah. It was mean. Your anger is misplaced. The beastmen saw an opportunity to feed hungry mouths and took it. People would get mad if something came and killed one of their animals, Raoul said. How is this any different? It's not, Captain Zaradnik replied. And that anger is also misplaced. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of the person in charge of those animals. Just like a shepherd is responsible for their sheep, the master of that dog is responsible for leaving it outside when they could have taken it into hiding with them. People are not animals in the same sense as dogs or sheep, though I've heard of soldiers referred to as dogs. But those in charge of them are ultimately responsible for what they do and what becomes of them. This is especially true for people who have been entrusted with the lives of others. Be they a noble or a commander, one has a responsibility to ensure that their subordinates are not squandered. Never forget that. 11th day, Upper Wind Month, 1 CE, 2300 hours. Oh, bless you, Thurgood. Bless you. You're a miracle worker. Snarls filled the air as 3 Irma cubs tore into the carcass of a modestly sized dog. The animal was a fortunate find. It had been standing out in the village where they had lured a group of blood-meat hulks. The lumbering undead monstrosities had unexpectedly emerged from the shore, too close for the refugees they were escorting to escape. Thurgakr and her warriors did not expect to survive, but it seemed that fortune was with them for once. Several of the tribespeople that they were escorting considered it a reward from the gods for Thurgakr's valor, but she and her warriors had only taken as much as they needed before offering the rest to the hungry refugees. Her tail lay limply on the ground as she watched the children eat. There were 5, at one point. 2 were still suckling and their mothers had been slain. Far from the stage where they could eat meat, they would have starved, so they were killed and burned in hopes that they wouldn't join the ranks of the undead. She imagined that the scene had repeated itself 100 times across the fleeing wave of Irma refugees. It would continue repeating itself unless the undead advance was somehow stopped. I can fight as many undead as required, but if I have to watch children get butchered again. Even when they weren't doing it directly, the undead brought suffering. She imagined that the lands that they fled through would be spawning more of them soon enough with all of the death and anguish that was wrought by the advancing horde. The lands of Irmakisha were doomed, and the long journey that started deep in the lands of their home country had been for naught. A twig snapped behind her. She jumped and flipped around to find one of her warriors who had gone out on patrol. "Anything?" she asked. "Nothing," the warrior, Kara, answered. "The bone vultures have thinned out and there's no sign of those blood-meat hulks." Thurgakr settled on her haunches, releasing a relieved breath. The civilians had been on the verge of collapse, but it now seemed that they had time to rest. They had found one of the strange forests that the humans managed for wood, hiding themselves in the thickest patch of trees. She wasn't sure how long they would be able to stay, but she was grateful for any reprieve. "How long do you think it will take before the undead catch up?" "It's hard to say," Kara replied. "It isn't as if we left people behind to see how far away the undead were. Most of them might have lost our trail with all the human settlements we've put between us. Those blood-meat hulks came from the sea, though. The human fishing villages will attract them ashore eventually." She scratched her rear in thought. "That town ahead, what do you think the chances are of the undead reaching it before we do?" There was a higher chance of finding food near towns. 1 or 2 human travelers would sustain them until they crossed the river south of Blighthold. If it was necessary, they could grab a meal off of the walls as they went by. "Hi," Kara said. "If the undead in the water keep advancing until a human settlement attracts them to the shore, they'll be far ahead of us by the time we finish resting, assuming the ones behind us don't catch up. If the undead ended up chasing humans around, it would likely buy them plenty of time to flee. They might even have time to hunt. I wonder if they have any traps in store," Thurgakr muttered. "Traps? Like the battle last night," Thurgakr said. "They had that powerful force come in from behind once everyone was in the valley. What if they try something like that again?" "We're in an open plain," Kara replied, so that would be difficult. The undead coming out of the water could surprise us like earlier today, so you could say that they did attempt to flank us there. They don't seem to care whether they are attacking us or the humans, though. That's the way the undead are, yes? It did make sense if one took a step back to examine the bigger picture. The undead had come, but, as far as she knew, they were indiscriminate in their hatred of the living. Even those with intelligence, such as elder liches, made little meaningful distinctions between humans, goblins or even fish. The flame of life had to be snuffed out, the land despoiled. While blame for drawing the undead horde might be placed squarely at the feet of the clans attacking the Draconic Kingdom's capital, now that the undead were here, they didn't have the luxury to point claws at one another. Banding together and destroying the unholy menace was the priority. Goro understood this, but Irmakisha rejected his advice in its pride. Now, most of Irmakisha likely fought against the living. We should rest, Thurgok said. No matter how we worry about it, these people are too tired to move. Let's draw lots for the watch. She ended up with the last watch and retired between the gnarled roots of an old oak tree. A wide yawn filled her mouth and she stretched before resting her head and closing her eyes. Someone shook her shoulder. A sharp whisper pierced the air. Thurgok. Wah-huh? The undead are coming. Thurgok forced herself upright, trying to shake her lethargy away. Where are they? They're entering the edge of the woods. Damn it. They had dark vision, but it didn't let them see vast distances in the darkness. Even with the moonlight, they could make out vague movements at best. Suffused as the air was with the reek of the undead horde, it was impossible to discern individual groups by scent. It felt that the undead turned themselves into a threat simply by shuffling forward. How many are there? About 24, Kara replied. Nothing strong. She knelt to shake one of the elders awake, pondering the information. Even if we win, Kara said, we shouldn't fight. Their controller will instantly note their loss. I know. I was just wondering if it was possible to hide in the branches or something. That's crazy. We might evade this bunch, but we'll end up in the middle of the horde. Would that be the case? There might be tens of thousands of undead, but, if they were stretched out across the countryside, they would be sparse. The 24 approaching their position might be all that there were. Let's move, she said. Once morning comes, we'll have a better idea of what's around us. Thurgok picked up one of the cubs and they set off into the night. Though it felt like she had just laid down to rest, the skies were already beginning to lighten. She looked to the mountains silhouetted in the east. Did you come up with some idea? Kara asked. It sounded like you wanted to do something once you could see what was around us. I was just thinking, Thurgok replied. If we could get behind them, we could just head east to the mountains. At this rate, they'll be chasing us for weeks. We aren't just escorting these Irma, Kara told her, we were sent to warn everyone else. Besides, these people are just as likely to be killed if they head east into the mountains. That wasn't true for Nakira, but it was for Irmakisha. Migrants that returned to their old territories were treated as invaders. They effectively were, as their intrusion also meant they would be consuming resources that the locals depended on. I would think we've passed beyond the point where that sort of response is warranted, Thurgok said. The undead threaten all. They do, Kara admitted, but I can imagine the fury of those clans when they see the undead coming in on our tails. Never mind Irmakisha, they'd kill us for that. She flicked her ears in vexation. As Kara said, they were just as likely to be blamed for bringing the undead into a tribe's territory as thanked for their warning. The competitive nature of the clans made cooperation and sometimes even communication difficult. Tribe and clan came before everything else, and all were aggressively protective of their territory. It was a feat in itself for them to come together as a country at all. That it was a country of many different races of beastmen made it all the more wondrous. A long history of blood drenched the mountain jungles, and it required the work of countless visionaries to forge the laws and traditions that made stability as a nation possible. Those laws and traditions only worked to an extent, however. They would certainly not hold back a clan enraged by a grievous incident. As a result, conflict between clans and even alliances of clans were not uncommon. And here we thought we'd be able to get away from all of that for once. Nakira thought they would be fighting humans. Even fighting the undead was fine, at least until it turned out to be an undead horde of legendary proportions. The field of stars was slowly washed away by the dawn, and Thurgak started to get a better sense of what was going on. Groups of undead, anywhere from a few dozen to over 100, were moving around in the distance. It was astonishing that they hadn't blindly run into any during their renewed flight. "So it turns out we're already in the middle of the undead horde," she grumbled. "We can't hunt like this," Kara complained. "From which dark god did this sick scenario spring forth? Maybe we'll find a farm animal fleeing from the undead as well?" Thurgak offered. "We were about 2 days from the river, now it's probably 3 since we have to get around all these new obstacles. Doesn't this mean that the undead will cross the river before we do?" "I'm afraid so." "Then go," Kara told her. "You're the strongest amongst us. If it's just you, you'll be able to cross the river by the end of the day. You don't even have to worry about us." Strangely enough, it's safer now that we have some sense of the behavior of these undead. All we have to do is avoid these settlements that they're being attracted to. Thurgak slowed to a stop, removing some of the pouches on her belt. "Take these," she said. "Emergency rations, plus a few water flasks." "What about you?" Kara asked. "I still have trade coins and another flask. Some potions, too. There should be plenty of opportunities to resupply once I get across the river." Kara nodded, distributing her pouches between the other warriors. "Hopefully the next clan lord won't be as foolish as Elin Horshra," he said. "I guess we'll next see you back at home. May the Lord of Storms and Lady of the Waters favor your journey." "So, did you get anything interesting out of that magician guild?" I'm not sure if it's interesting, exactly, but they do have some stuff I've never seen before here." After tucking in her apprentices for the night, she wasn't sure if they were already too old for that, but she did it anyway. Ludmilla disembarked from Ruin's Wake to see how things were going in the city. She found Captain Iska and Miss Marchand packing away their makeshift merchant stand. Skeleton warriors went back and forth, organizing cargo on the pier. A sign had been placed facing the wharf. Upon the sign was a warning written in several different languages. "Access restricted. Violators will be reanimated." Skulls were drawn on either side of the warning. Ludmilla wondered if anyone would dare to cross. "What sort of stuff?" she asked. "I guess it's what you'd expect to find in a port city, my lady," Captain Iska answered. "Divination spells for maritime navigation, a whole lot of spells for inventory management and cargo handling, spells for operating underwater, some maintenance magic. Honestly, I'm not sure if they're worth learning. Since they're mostly spells that aren't really dependent on the power of the caster, they're the sort of that you'd buy ones for. A staff would be even better. But someone has to learn the spell to craft magic items with those effects, yes? That's what civilian artisans are for," the Elder Lich said. "Casters on the field need to devote their time and resources to learning spells that are better cast by whatever they are and rely on items for the other stuff. For instance, if you're a war wizard aiming to be a fire elementalist, it's better to learn Scorching Ray as a second-tier spell than it is to learn Darkness. Your Scorching Ray spell will be far better than anything a wand can spit out, and, since Darkness doesn't rely on caster power or the resistance of those affected, you can just purchase a Darkness item. What if you can't find someone that sells an item that casts a spell that you decided was unnecessary to learn?" "Well, that's a problem in itself," Captain Iska replied. "Presumably, different places will have differing demands for magic based on whatever the locals need, so a little shopping adventure would be called for. Unfortunately, magic seems to be exclusive rather than inclusive around these parts, so that idea might fall flat. On top of that, magic for civilian applications is plentiful, but everything else is just plain inaccessible. Ruin's Wake's hoppin' mad over how impossible it is to find druid stuff nearly everywhere we go. She had no idea how a ghost ship could use a scroll, wand or any other magic item." "Where did you manage to find druid stuff?" "The Lizardman village at the Great Lake in Tob and the Lizardman village in Warden's Vale." "Makes you think that Lizardmen have a monopoly on druidic magic." Ludmilla wondered if the ghost ship could find any use for druid spells wielded by Lizardmen. Ruin's Wake was something like a negative energy druid, or at least a druid that tended to negative energy ecologies, while the Lizardman druids supported living communities. "That's probably something we'll want to promote in the Sorcerer's Kingdom," Ludmilla said. "The vast majority of priests and shamans in our demi-human communities are actually druids. If we want druidic magic to grow and flourish, some sort of institution should be established for it." Arcane casters have the Magician Guild and its affiliates. Priests and clerics have the temples, but we don't have any official druidic circles. It was strange that they didn't, considering Lord Mayor's influence in the Sorceress Kingdom. Then again, the Dark Elf Druid was mostly aloof from anything beyond his duties. According to Lady Aura, he was always either working, experimenting on things that might help with his work, or lazing around in bed. Miss Marchand rose from her table, closing her ledgers and gathering them into her arms. She came over to greet Ludmilla with a bow. "Good evening, Lady Saradnik. Apologies for not coming to see you immediately." "There is no need to apologize, Miss Marchand." "Sorry, just force of habit, I guess. As a merchant, it is almost always better to play it safe. Especially when dealing with powerful people." "Has anyone been giving you any trouble?" Ludmilla asked. "Not in Blighthold, no," Miss Marchand answered. "There is something to be said for having everything that they need while also having the power to wipe out their entire city. What I mentioned is more of a thing in the Sorceress Kingdom where His Majesty's might enforce his order." Ludmilla frowned at her reply. "What do you mean by that?" "It is just the way things are, my lady. Much has changed in the Sorceress Kingdom, but people do not change so quickly, if at all. They have just adapted to the new reality. Merchants like keeping business smooth, so that means being flexible with all of the different parties we have to deal with. I understand that Ruin's Wake plied a route through tribal territories. Are you referring to your interactions with the demi-humans there?" Miss Marchand's face broke out into a smile. "Oh no," she laughed, "I like that route. It is not exactly the most lucrative, but, I guess I like how cute they are." "Cute?" "Yes, cute. Everyone out there is new to commerce and they barely have anything, so I have a whole lot of fun bartering and teaching them things. It is very gratifying watching all of those little trade outposts grow over time." It may have been because merchants tended to adapt quickly, but Miss Marchand appeared to have embraced the idea that the Sorcerer King wished to extend his benevolence over all of his subjects and not just humans. Hopefully, it was a sign of things to come for the rest of the population. "In that case," Ludmilla said, "what have you been having trouble with?" "It is not trouble, per se, it has more to do with cultural expectations. Certain people expect others to behave a certain way, and that behavior is dependent on where each party in the interaction stands in the hierarchy. Law and order are maintained to an unprecedented degree in the Sorceress Kingdom, and hierarchy is order. Everything from before just jumps over and fits itself into how things are now. If something illegal is going on—" "Nothing of the sort, my lady," Miss Marchand replied. "If anything, it is the opposite of that. People observe customs and traditions that are proven to work within the boundaries of the law." Even if she said so, it sounded as if something was happening that shouldn't be. Ruin's Wake's purser seemed to sense her confusion and gestured towards the refugees lining the wharf. "Take those fellows, for instance," she said. "Most of them will do extra to get what they need. That can be as simple as being polite or ingratiating themselves to others. They might leverage charisma and sex appeal, or band together to give themselves more clout. Some of them might have special skills or come from vocations that make them more useful in this situation. They might have illiquid assets or a position that is useless for now, but will be seen as valuable in the future and used to influence others in the present. None of what I described is explicitly illegal and can be used to further one's ends. But they do not employ it in their dealings with you." "They certainly try, my lady. You were even there when that first guy tried to buy up all of our cargo by throwing money at us. Then he tried to appeal to my pride and sensibilities as a merchant. And then he tried to procure goods via proxy through his laborers." "That last one is definitely illegal," Ludmilla noted. "Theft is illegal, yes. But we don't know how justice is carried out in the Draconic Kingdom. He could have claimed it was a misunderstanding or the laborer could have pretended to be stupid. The merchant might have just asserted that it was an independent act of theft on the part of the laborer, and that is entirely plausible. In the end, someone thought that it was worth the risk, and who gets the blame is out of our hands. Unlike back home, we cannot rely on mind control to collect statements. An attempt at theft wouldn't have worked at all in the Sorceress Kingdom, but the rest of it seemed normal enough that Ludmilla had never considered them in the way that Miss Marchand had framed things. "What would you say is the most problematic aspect of this in the Sorceress Kingdom?" Ludmilla asked. Probably when the underlying hierarchies behind everything get abused and pecking orders are established, Miss Marchand answered. For every person that actively tries to ensure that what they are doing is just, there are 3 others who think that what they are doing is normal and another who unapologetically exploits their advantage. The last does not even have to be malevolent, both good and bad people try to further their own ends like that. But we have regulatory bodies that watch for this sort of thing, yes? The Merchant Guild, for example. They can only regulate things that happen. This probably applies to any institution. No one can enforce things that are implied. Trying to is an exercise in futility. A small merchant will conduct business with a more powerful party not just for the sole purpose of a single transaction, but because they are trying to cultivate a relationship with that party. That relationship implies various things: future business, a source of information, a degree of protection, and potentially tapping into that party's circle of contacts. The list goes on. It is impossible to say whether any of that is fair until their efforts bear fruit. If it happens, the merchant would usually be lauded for being shrewd, having foresight, or a good sense for business. But it also tends to have the effect of making the party that they are dealing with bigger. That, in turn, draws more business to them, and they continue to grow until they reach some limit or start meeting resistance. For a noble, it usually stops at the amount of wealth and influence that their land can bring them. For merchants, it is however far they can expand their commercial reach. For a country, well, look at what we are doing right now. We are trying to get bigger economically and politically. So, Ludmilla said, in the end, these hierarchies and how they are employed must be judged on a case-by-case basis. Maybe, Miss Marchand shrugged. This is just my perspective as a merchant. Figuring out whether things are good or bad for a country is usually the job of rulers, and that does not help us here. We just have to figure out how to play by the Draconic Kingdom's rules. Never mind the Draconic Kingdom's rules, Ludmilla found many of the cultural nuances in the Sorceress Kingdom indecipherable. Her father probably had the right idea. It was better to remain reserved and stick to what she was good at. At least her friends were around to translate her grunting. Ludmilla parted ways with Captain Iska and Miss Marchand, walking north up the wharf to enter the nearest tower. The battlements had been cleared and sentries once again manned their positions, sporting a hodgepodge of unfortunate-looking equipment. With supplies restricted by the beastmen, what they had amounted to sharpened sticks of varying lengths, rocks to toss down at beastmen scaling the walls, and tattered armor that would have been marked for salvage in any other situation. As for the sentries themselves, Nadim Balik had organized the city into gangs of sorts. Adult men who didn't serve crucial roles in supporting the city's operations were rotated onto the walls to serve their time. In short, they were conscripts. While the informal way in which they had been ordered led to several questions, conscription for the purposes of defense against the beastmen was indeed legal in the Draconic Kingdom. It was another case in which the people were trying to hold things together when nearly everything had fallen apart, so Ludmilla didn't feel that she had any right to criticize their methods. After checking to see that her security measures for the city were being observed, she took off from the southern wall to see what effect the approaching undead horde was having on the countryside. Across the Sealan estuary, the beastmen had scattered from Ruin's Wake's assault. Ludmilla's general staff had sent roughly half of their bone vultures to observe their movements, but most of the beastmen had collected themselves after the initial panic and appeared to be digesting what was going on. Ludmilla took the opportunity to order the recovery of the ferry connecting the coastal highway and had it brought into Blighthold's harbor. She wasn't sure if the beastmen would return to raid the city for food again, but denying them an easy crossing was a given. After a cursory inspection of the abandoned beastman positions across the river, she flew northwest to see how her undead horde was doing. Her first destination was the town up the highway from Blighthold, where she found Psycho and several elder liches overseeing its downfall. Ludmilla furrowed her brow at the sight of the town's sentries, who had gathered on the northern wall to fearfully watch the approaching mass of assorted undead. "Psycho," she asked, "did you contact the citizens below?" "Attempts were made, Captain," the elder lich replied, "but we achieved no success." "We?" Psycho turned his skull to regard several of the other elder liches nearby. "There was a debate over who could deliver the most reassuring message," Psycho said. "Several asserted that my wording was ineffective." "What did you say?" Ludmilla asked. "You are being conquered. Please do not resist." "I see." She understood what Psycho was trying to say, but she doubted that the citizens did. "How did they reply?" The message spell expired before the individual could render a response. I suppose the ghost of Gartenbag grips the people here, as well. That legend makes little sense, Psycho said. The destruction of the country should have been thwarted by basic authentication protocols. That was what she also believed, but it didn't matter to the rest of the world. A nonsensical legend about a country being destroyed by 3 message spells had essentially turned the use of the spell to convey information into a taboo nearly everywhere. The Empire had special communication officers who employed the spell for military applications, but the Sorceress Kingdom was the only place she knew of where it was in common use. This one believes that rescued should have been used instead of conquered, one of the elder liches floating nearby said. Liberated, another offered. The efficiency of concise communication is to be lauded, another elder lich said, but humans require elaboration. Indeed, said another, informing them of the helpful and friendly nature of our forces would have set their minds at ease. A lit bug should have been procured for these tasks. Studies show that humans feel less threatened and are more receptive to female voices. This effect appears to extend to other races, as some servitors have observed of Baroness Gonye in her interactions around the Sorcerer's Kingdom. None of you obtained any tangible results when you made your attempts, Psycho said. As for the use of a lit bug, the lit bug would need to be the caster of the message spell. Ludmilla tried to imagine how the residents of the town might have felt upon being bombarded by dubious-sounding voices popping up in their heads, trying to reassure them of the friendly nature of the undead horde and advising them to not resist. Her imagination failed her upon trying to envision an elder lich attempting to imitate Florian's dulcet tones. I'll speak to them in person once the beastmen have advanced further along, she said. How have our amended procedures worked out so far? Enemy movements have been streamlined as a result, Psycho told her. While their progress has been notably slowed, it has also become far easier to manage them. How about the human populations we've been imposing on? Most were already hiding in their homes. A few settlements appeared more oblivious than others, but that was a simple matter to remedy. Both our general staff and command staff at home conclude that it should be an effective practice for the remainder of the campaign. That's good to hear, Ludmilla said. Now, all that's left is to free up the Draconic Kingdom's forces in Highfoot. After that, we should be clear to deliver officials from the capital to the liberated lands. Her gaze went inland, where hundreds of villagers cowered from the passage of both the beastmen and the undead. Though the threat of being wiped out by the beastmen was now no more, a long, hard road to recovery still lay ahead. From commoner to noble, every citizen of the Draconic Kingdom had their work cut out for them.